All right, got a little current events analysis for you guys here. This is an article from Yahoo News titled Biden Wants to Shut Down Credit Bureaus. What would that mean for you? Well, I can tell you, in short, it means you're going to get fucked, but we'll go through the article a little bit just in case there's a little, nugget of reasonability here. But one of the more fascinating platform items of the Biden presidential campaign was the idea of transferring consumer credit ratings from Equifax, Experian, and TransUnion to a public registry under the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Oh, so yeah, you definitely get fucked because it's part of this whole thing to move us toward a system that's a lot more similar to China's social credit score, where if you say the wrong thing on Facebook, now you can't get a mortgage loan. So so far, so good insofar as you getting fucked is concerned. We continue on as reported by The Balance. I guess that's probably some shitty left-wing publication. This idea was examined in depth by a paper published by a think tank called Demos in 2019. One major takeaway of that paper was that decisions drawing on credit data reproduce and spread existing racial inequality, making it hard to achieve true economic equity. Demos, proposed the idea of a public credit registry in that paper. So again, as I had suspected in the first paragraph, this is gonna, they're gonna expand it a little bit, or this is gonna be the beginning to the expansion of a system where basically the government keeps track of how good of a person you are, which will impact how you're able to move economically. The idea that the FICO scoring system is racist is absurd. If you have bad credit, that's because you make bad decisions. I know plenty of white folks with bad credit, and funnily enough, they make the same decision as black folks with bad credit have that lead to them having bad credit, like not paying your fucking credit card bill, okay? It's not very hard to, let's say when you get your first credit card, to say, well, I have $1,000 to spend here. Let's go use a calculator, which is available for free on a cell phone, which virtually everybody has, and see, wow, what are the payments going to be per month on this? Maybe I shouldn't go buy a fucking Xbox, a PS5, and a 75-inch TV if I can't afford the minimum payment, and it's amazing to me how often folks are shocked by the amount of interest that they're going to end up paying on a particular loan. When it's like, did you think it was cheap? Do you not realize that 25% APR is a shitload of interest to pay? And don't get me wrong, I carried balances on credit cards for close to a decade. Learned my lesson. I'm not going to sit here, though, and claim that it was systemic injustice that led to that. It was my poor decision making, which was impacted by the shit show of education I and others received up to this point. But the other issue is that there will not and cannot be true economic equity. That's basically looking for or trying to create policies of equality of outcome, which cannot happen. It doesn't, and it's not relegated to race either. So a stupid white person with an IQ of 80 is going to do very poorly, just as a stupid black person or a stupid Mexican or a stupid Asian with an IQ of 80 is also going to do very poorly. In fact, if you take IQ scores and kind of use them to look at socioeconomic disparities, it has the effect of sort of clarifying the difference here, in that it's related much more to IQ than it is some idiotic boogeyman like systemic racism. So the CFPB has a new acting director, David Uggio, who recently replaced Trump appointee Kathleen Kraniger. In a CFPB blog post dated January 28th, Uggio stated his two main priorities would be relief for consumers facing hardship due to COVID-19 and the related economic crisis, and two, racial equity. But nowhere does this statement specifically mention the idea of a public credit reporting agency. So it's kind of ironic because the government almost completely caused the hardships due to COVID-19. As I've said many times, the rate of death from the disease is less than 1% for almost everybody, with the people that are most affected by it often, not always, but often being in such a position because of poor decisions they continuously made. So when it comes to racial equity, again, we have to look at IQ scores, decision making, this, that, and the other. It's no mystery, and it should not be overlooked at all, that when you take a country, let's say in Latin America, maybe Central America or Northern South America, the IQs tend to be lower. And on top of that, we see a lot of cultural things that really, really negatively impact the overall economic function of the superorganism that is the country. And that, take Colombia or a lot of these Latin American countries, there's a they call it tranquilo, very chill kind of way of doing things. So it's like if you have a meeting set up with somebody at 3 p.m., shit, they might show up at 2:45, they might show up at 3:15, they might not show up at all. And on the face of it, that's not big of a deal. But when you extrapolate that and take its cumulative effect on the society as a whole, it very much slows down, if not makes it impossible, to do consistent and predictable business dealings with people. And that consistent and predictable way of doing business is what allows these richer countries to do as they are. And so when you combine the fact that IQs are lower and there's all these cultural misgivings that make economic productivity much less likely, it takes a lot of steam out of the whole racist white guy is why minorities and women are doing bad. And let's also not forget that the United States is the richest country or one of the richest countries on earth. And I don't see why it's my responsibility or anybody else's responsibility to sit there and come in and save somebody who didn't have an emergency fund saved up. I mean, a lot of us, for years leading up to this COVID shit, this shit show, we're talking about the importance of making sure that you've got at least a few months of bills saved up. And a lot of people thought, well, it's the United States, nothing's going to happen. And for a lot of most of I guess the last century, that was true. But now those of us like me and others that established a small emergency fund, who went through great discomfort in order to do so, did not feel the economic hardship of COVID-19, which, as I've said, was totally induced by Uncle Sam. It might sound ridiculous, but when you get down to it, a lot of the economic complaints that people have, regardless of their race or gender, come down to laziness, At the end of the day, it's painfully easy to go get a factory job for $10 or $11 an hour. Half of us live in a warm area in this country. So, and again, this might sound ridiculous, and it only does because of the degree to which people in the modern West are extraordinarily lazy, but why not go live in a tent and eat fucking canned garbanzo beans and Spam for 6 months while you build up a $6,000 or $7,000 backup fund, which you then obviously have to manage correctly. So that's why I say it's laziness, because that's your choice that prevented you from doing that. And it's not my responsibility as somebody who didn't fuck up like that, who isn't a lazy fuck, to come in and save you. That's bullshit. So it's not that there's some systemic issue that creates inequality of outcome. It's that people are different, have different talents. And this obsession with socioeconomic success that we have, is at the very least now due for another visit, another analysis. Let's take a look at these kind of ideas that we have that really seem to be doing nothing but fucking people over. Continuing on, the 3 primary reporting agencies analyze consumer borrowing and repayment patterns. They assign scores that are then used to assess a person's credit worthiness. This can affect their access to an apartment and their ability to hold certain jobs, in addition to the amount they can borrow and the interest rates that they are charged. It's big business, enough to support 3 public companies, although they have other businesses as well. So is it a problem that there's some kind of system out there that keeps track of how people behave financially? I see a lot of this bitching, almost like class warfare between people who have property and rent it out and the tenants that don't have property and rent from them. And I have yet to once come in contact with a tenant that has any understanding of the expense that's involved in upkeeping a property. You're a tenant for a reason, not that I can talk shit in my, Port Huron rental chalet here, but, to get a property, to maintain a property, it's really not like every single landlord is some fat cat. So to sit there and get upset with them because they don't rent to you because it's obvious on paper that you're a shit tenant, and on top of not paying the rent will probably fuck stuff up, leave the unit a mess, be difficult, maybe not even pay your rent when, the communists take over via the, under the guise of the COVID relief package takes over. So it's like, you really got to keep in mind that almost 1 in 2 landlords in the United States only own 1 property, and those people, they do not have, I don't give a shit if they, even if they're in the minority of people that own it outright, they do not have the leeway or the wherewithal to sit out here and basically act as charities for people who made bad decisions and fucked up their own lives. You fucked up, you pay for it. It's simple. That way, when you do well, you enjoy the benefits. It works. And I know it sounds kind of harsh, but in the modern US, it is far and away easier than it's ever been in human history to have upward mobility, although that's beginning to fade, and enjoy financial security and access to resources that a lot of upper class people have. While lenders certainly have the right to determine the risk of a potential borrower, the problem is the lack of transparency in the process. The three bureaus have slightly different calculation methods and data sources, which can result in the same person having three very different credit scores. Some of the criteria seem unusual and can be gamed. Yeah, well, as a side note, the whole FICO scoring system is a giant joke. If you have credit problems, I know one guy that's really good at fixing that shit, and it is way easier than you might think, which is the whole kind of irony about this, is that the whole system can be gamed pretty fucking easily, you know? So again, it's like, why are you, again, we get back to this lack of gusto, this lack of self-reliance, this lack of responsibility, this lack of action that, you know, I'm too lazy, too stupid, too disenfranchised, too despondent to figure it out myself. So I guess I'll go support the government's action to go take money from other people who aren't as fucked up as I am to pay for me, which fucks over the people that did better and doesn't help me at all because there's nothing pushing me forward to change in the way that I need to in order to not be a fucking loser. So, for example, it is better to have a high limit credit card and only charge part of it than to charge the same amount to a low limit credit card. Paying off a mortgage can reduce a credit score. Well, applying for a mortgage can reduce a credit score. Who gives a fuck? In addition, errors are common but difficult to correct. That is not true. There's some evidence of racial biases as well. Well, that's the thing. If you're looking for evidence of any particular phenomenon, you can find it anywhere. Which in turn affects access to housing, certain jobs, and credit. People have the right to free copies of their credit report once a year, but have to pay beyond that. Okay? Again, well, that's really not even true. I mean, the amount of credit card companies that offer, you know, free, continuing, instantaneous access to credit reports, I mean, they're legion. So it's, you know, again, not really, it's a non sequitur. It's like this whole, or not a non sequitur, I don't even know what the fuck that is, but it's like this whole, you know, we don't need voter IDs. When you get down to it, it's basically saying that black people are too fucking stupid to go get an ID. That's ridiculous. That is flat out fucking stupid. They are not that dumb. They can go get a fucking ID. It's easy, you know, especially with YouTube. I mean, what? I know plenty of white people, seriously, that can't fucking read. They have an ID, so, you know, in reality, they just say that type of shit, so it's easier to get illegals in here to vote for Democrats, and it's kind of like backdoor gerrymandering. But I digress. The Biden proposal would improve people's access to their credit and may lead to standardized calculations. Okay, well, if you're complaining about how scores are too low, wouldn't you want a greater variation? Wouldn't you want a system that's easier to game so people can get higher fucking... It's like, you know, this shit makes no sense. It could also lead to volatility if the criteria used changed with each presidential administration. That's a pretty good point. There are also credit bureaus out there that use different scoring criteria, often used by lenders that work with customers who have bad credit. It's unclear how this proposal would affect them. So at the end of the day, guys, it comes down to this whole socialist mindset where people that do well get taxed to support people who don't do well. And at the surface, it sounds great, like, oh yeah, I want to help out whoever's, but it doesn't, like, helping people in any capacity is an extremely challenging thing to do. In almost no circumstance does just giving somebody money, especially on a long-term basis, or changing things in society so it can be better for them in their shitty state, that doesn't help them, you know? And the sad part is that it's really not like, it's not like some Herculean task. It's not like you're going to get a fucking doctorate degree. Changing the things that you do, changing your ideas, changing the stuff that you do so that you're no longer stuck in the under or lower classes is not that fucking complicated. So we don't need to address non-existent systemic issues with credit scoring or with the economy that lead to disparate economic outcomes for different racial groups. It's like, what? You know, go look at the majority of white people in this country. A lot of them are fucking broke. So again, it's a boogeyman used by those at the top to try and keep us divided, because the more that we're infighting with each other, the less likely we are to look up at the top and go, hey, you know what, actually, it's those guys that are fucking us over.